Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Timothy Hampton. I am the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's event with this year's Avenali Professor in the Humanities. We will be featuring the 23rd Poet Laureate of the United States, Joy Harjo, in conversation with poet and critic Craig Santos Perez. Tomorrow, at the same time and on this same Zoom station, Joy Harjo will be in conversation with writer and critic Beth Payatot, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Native American Studies at Berkeley. They will discuss Harjo's signature project as Poet Laureate, which is called Living Nations, Living Words. Before we move to our main event, let me say a quick word about the Avenali Endowment. The Avenali Chair in the Humanities was established in 1987. It enables a distinguished figure in the arts and humanities to come to Berkeley annually to deliver a major lecture and to engage with students and faculty. Past Avenali lecturers have included the historian Jill Lepore, the South African artist William Kentridge, the dance critic Joan Acosella, author Michael Pollan, and photographer Sebastião Salgado. The Avenali Chair in the Humanities is made possible through the generous gift of Peter and Joan Avenali. Peter Avenali earned a bachelor's degree in English from Berkeley in 1939. For more than 40 years, he worked with the investment consulting firm of Dodge and Cox. He was a significant donor to a variety of campus programs, including the Lawrence Hall of Science and the Chancellor Scholarships. And he served on the advisory committee of the Berkeley Foundation. Joan Avenali, a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College, served 4 years in the Navy during World War II, raised 3 children, and has been active in numerous civic and charitable organizations in the Bay Area. Their gift to the university has been extraordinarily important to our students, faculty, and intellectual community, and we express our heartfelt appreciation. This year's Avenali Professor, Joy Harjo, as I have noted, is the 23rd Poet Laureate of the United States. She is the first Native American writer to hold that position, as she is an enrolled member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. For nearly 40 years, she has been an important figure on the American literary scene as poet, dramatist, storyteller, memoirist, and editor. Integral to her poetic vision has been as well her work as a performing artist and musician, as she has released 6 albums of music cutting across boundaries between jazz, Native American song, spoken word, and world music. Among her many recent projects are 2 verse collections, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings from 2017, and American Sunrise from 2019, and a Norton Anthology of Native Nations Poetry published in 2020, titled When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through. She also has a new album out, we just learned today, that has just been released called I Pray for My Enemies. It's a true honor to have Joy Harjo with us today. This evening, she will be talking about her work with Craig Santos Perez, himself an award-winning poet and author of a number of volumes of verse, most recently Habitat Threshold, published last year. An indigenous Chamorro born on the island of Guam, Craig is a graduate alumnus of UC Berkeley and currently serves as professor of English at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Our guests will talk for about 45 minutes and then take questions, so feel free to use the chat function to communicate. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Craig and Joy and to welcome both of them and all of you back to Berkeley.
Afade, aloha. Thank you so much, Tim, and to the Townsend Center. I'm so honored to be part of this lecture series and conversation with Joy Harjo. I want to acknowledge the Ohlone peoples of Berkeley, as well as the Native Hawaiian people, since I am Zooming from Oahu in the Hawaiian archipelago. I also want to acknowledge Joy, who has inspired so many Native writers, including myself, who is now serving a rare 3rd term as US Poet Laureate, and who has produced so much inspirational poetry and who has edited several anthologies, including the one we'll be talking about today. I have so many questions for you, Joy, but before I jumped into them, I wanted to give you a chance to make any acknowledgements or just to check in and let us know where you're zooming in from and how you're doing.
Yes, I'm here in the Muskogee Creek Nation Reservation here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'm near the border of 3 nations, the Osage, Cherokee, and then the Muskogee Creek Nation. And then I'm within a few blocks of the 1921, what's called Black Wall Street, of the 1921 race massacre. And this year marks the 100th anniversary, since that shameful moment in time. But I'm here, and I'm honored to be here and acknowledge the Hawai'i nei and also the Berkeley area, which has always been important to so many of us as a place of ideas and poetry, and I guess tonight too, thinking of Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who has given us the culture, so much, in terms of poetry and supportive poetry, and so I wanted to also acknowledge him. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you, Craig.
Yes, thank you for those acknowledgments, and we do miss you out here in Hawaii. So we wanted to offer you this virtual lei, which will hold on to you when we can reunite in person once again here in the islands. But thank you so much. This anthology has really lifted my spirits since a copy arrived to us here. I've been reading it the last couple of weeks in preparation for our conversation. And it's just an amazing, incredible work. And for all the audience members, I definitely recommend you get a copy, because it surely did lift my spirits during these difficult times. Yes, beautiful cover. Now, since origin stories and creation stories are so important, in your work and of course in Indigenous cultures, I wanted to start by asking if you could share a little bit about the origin story of this anthology.
Yes, there had been talk between Norton and me for some time. Every once in a while, it would come up about doing a Norton anthology, and I wanted to do. I guess what I did, I told my editor that we did not have a Norton anthology of Native literature, period, because we still don't have one. We have, and the textbook, I guess the textbook editor said, well, we can't make our money back with all the permissions fees, but we would love it if you would do a Norton anthology of Native poetry. Now, about 15, 20 years ago, Gloria Bird and I edited a Norton anthology of contemporary Native women's poetry called Reinventing the Enemy's Language. But there had been no comprehensive, I say comprehensive, I guess I should go like that, because how comprehensive can you be with so many tribal nations and languages, and over a span of, it would probably be the whole Western Hemisphere, in 300-400 pages.
Mm-hmm.
So this could have been several volumes long. And I understand, not everyone is in it, but it's as comprehensive as we could make it. So the only reason I looked around and thinking, okay, how can we put this together? And I've noted that most Norton anthologies usually there's a huge list of experts, academic experts. And I thought it's, Native poets, we're always, I think we're always studying, and we know the field, we know each other, we come at it from many different ways. Some of us from more traditional language ways, some of us more from university program ways. But I worked and assembled a team of Indigenous editors, so that all poets. I considered bringing other people in with it, but we thought, no, it's all poets. And at that time, I was Chair of Excellence at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and they were very supportive. So I went to my department chair and asked, I said, can I do, my class next semester, can it be how to put together, it would be about Native poetry, but essentially the class is how to put together a Norton anthology. It was actually an exciting class because we had, people who had put together anthologies come and speak. We had somebody come in and speak on permissions, all the aspects of putting together an anthology. And we had, this was before Zoom, we had Skype calls with the different teams of Native poets in discussion about, what belongs here, how we should organize. It was exciting, but a lot of work. And I couldn't have done it without all the support too of the university or with everyone, because it was it's overwhelming at first. But I was very lucky. The team was wonderful, and Leanne Howe worked right next to me, and so did Jennifer Forrester. And I think it turned out beautifully, but it was a difficult puzzle because, first of all, we were told in the first contract, it's like, okay, we can give you 300 pages. And it's like,
not enough.
no. So we got up to 400, but we could have easily made it 800. But I don't know, when I was coming up through the university, we used to have these gigantic Norton anthologies, but anymore, what the textbook division says, people don't read as much as they used to anymore. So they're not making the huge anthologies anymore.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that story with us. I really love the collaborative nature of this anthology. Leanne Howe and Jennifer Forster, you mentioned as your two main co-editors, but there's also around a dozen contributing editors, regional advisors, managing editors, editorial assistants, assistant editors. And, I appreciate so much that you made this anthology, also a pedagogical and educational experience for your own students, which I think it's so important. And the way you brought in so many other Indigenous poets, some of whom had editing experience and some who learned, through working on this project, I'm sure. And I think that collaborative spirit really shines through. It feels like a chorus or a quilt or a gathering, a feast that is really inspiring. So thank you for doing that. I wanted to ask you as well about the title, which is really striking. When the light of the world was subdued, our songs came through. And just reading the anthology, I got the sense that it was inspired partly by the Kumulipo, which is a Hawaiian creation chant that's included here. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about where this title comes from and what inspired it.
Yes, you're right. It was reading that very small segment, that excerpt from the Kumulipo, the Hawaiian creation chant. And in the English translation of it, I'll read the English version. At the time that turned the heat of the earth, at the time when the heavens turned and changed, at the time when the light of the sun was subdued to cause light to break forth, at the time of Makali'i, then began the slime which established the earth to source of deepest darkness, of the depth of darkness, of the depth of darkness, of the darkness of the sun in the depth of night. It is night, so was light born. And I was thinking about the timing of this anthology and about how growing up and coming up as a young woman, I would always like to go to those circles of elders, of people who knew things. And I remember them saying, yes, that the sun isn't as bright as it used to be because of pollution. That the sun used to be a lot brighter. And of course, the waters were not, were bluer. They weren't as polluted and so on. And I was thinking about how in these times, and little did I know the pandemic was coming, in these, among other things that we've been dealing with as human beings on this beloved earth, where we are the earth. And, this was a time when the light of the world was subdued. I mean, in so many ways. And our songs, our poetry came through, which has proven so much during these times about how many people, how people have turned to poetry. And we've always turned to poetry, whether it was oral or actually written down. And, Its poetry is, it's song making, it's kind of song making that is profound and usually full of metaphors and beauty that lifts us into places that open up like fresh water within ourselves.
Yes, that's beautiful. And I really appreciate how, this anthology does highlight how our songs came through. And through this anthology, we get to read the songs and poetry of over 160 poets from 4 different centuries, from the long past to younger writers, in their late 20s, early 30s. And I was wondering if you can talk about, why you decided to include such a scope across time and space of poetry ancestors and this kind of literary genealogy.
Because it hasn't been done yet. And this is only a beginning. It's not the penultimate. This is a beginning. I've always wanted to see one of the whole Western Hemisphere, because the Western Hemisphere, as a Bolivian native woman reminded us once at a gathering outside Quito in the mountains, that this is one body. And but it's a beginning. I mean, there have been several what I call, ancestor anthologies, including Alison Hedge Singh, and there are several other anthologies. The recent one by Hyde Erdrich, edited by Hyde Erdrich, and so on. But there had been no anthology that had really crossed, for, like you said, 4 different centuries, and tried to be inclusive, to show there's not just one poet, one native poet or the poet laureate. We have all kinds of poets and poet laureates and poets in poetry is so crucial. And I came of age, I realized when I was working on this with everyone, that I came of age in a time, and often with a lot of younger writers, we had some older, my generation, is that I remember going to Indian school and I realized that most of us were within a generation of being in cultures that were primarily oral, which means that there was a great love of the oral tradition our ears were aware, our ears were more, maybe it's like that, our ears were more open rather than more visually focused. And that's kind of interesting. I mean, so that there's a shift that happens there, where the difference between language being something that is experienced viscerally rather than, I think of it being like freeze dried. It comes alive. I mean, it does come alive in its own way, but it's different. And I remember being at Indian school and how close people were to that and to those kinds of modes, which didn't always translate in an English class in high school, where they were giving us 4th grade readers because they thought we were at that level.
Yeah, indeed. I really love how, the anthology, because of your selections, it really embodies, 7-generation thinking. It embodies, literary genealogy, and embodies that interconnection between the past and the present. And, kind of captures an indigenous sense of time as well, because there is such a cyclical feeling as one reads through the anthology, moving across the generations and centuries. And I think that's also evident in how you structure the sections, which are geographical. So there's almost this indigenous, temporality as well as spatiality. Now, for those who haven't read the anthology, there's 5 sections. One is Northeast and Midwest, then Plains and Mountains, then Pacific Northwest, Alaska and Pacific Islands, Southwest and West, and finally Southeast. So can you talk a little bit about why you decided to arrange the anthology in this way?
Because because we're the earth, and our expression, I believe that our expression, it's not just I believe, I think it becomes evident, and it became very evident as we edited, is so bound up with the plants and the earth and the shape of the earth from, which we emerge into this kind of consciousness as human beings, as caretakers or guardians and participants in this experience of earthliness and a certain kind of timeliness. So that's why we decided to start with, just divide it into geographical areas based loosely. I mean, there's no system that works perfectly, and the edges don't always meet. There's overlaps and so on. But that made the most sense. And because it turns out, and that wasn't deliberate, that the three editors are Southeastern native, in our way of going direction-wise, because we go counterclockwise. So we would start at the east, go north and west, and come back around south and so on. And because of that, we were kind of south, we let the northeast go first, and then we ended with us. But yeah, that was very deliberate, and to kind of make a statement that way too. But so much is covered, in these sections. I mean, it's like the Pacific Northwest, the islands, the Pacific Islands, and what is that whole section in Alaska? I mean, there could be an anthology this big of just the Pacific Islands. There could be one this large for all the Alaska Native peoples and literature, the poetry. There could be one this big just for the Pacific Northwest, because there are many, many different tribal nations and groups throughout all of that area that are, and one poem just cannot represent it, or a few, or it just, or a generation, because we're also, as we were putting together this puzzle of an anthology, we were also looking at generations, as you said, and I'm glad you pointed that out, looking at generations and trying to deal with areas and generations and so on. And I think it's interesting is when you mentioned the seventh generation thinking, that the section of the Pacific in Alaska and Pacific Northwest and the Pacific Islands is Kumulipo begins it. Mm-hmm. And the ending piece is, and that section is by Jamaica Osorio. Mm-hmm. And it is so much, there's a genealogy. It ends, there's a genealogy, and she's so much younger. And I love that, because the framing of that is, we didn't, the framing of it just worked out because it's by age, it's chronological. In those sections, it becomes chronological. So you get a sense of how the works move through time. So what happens is you can start seeing in different geographical areas how colonization moved upon a people, according to time and placement, and according to the Western movement and manifest destiny and so on. It becomes very evident.
Yeah, I thought that was really powerful, because the way I read it, this book is in sections. So, I basically read in 5 sittings, and that was a powerful experience because you get to read each geography, and it's, in that certain chronology, but then you go to the next section the next day and you're in a different geography, but you go back in time and forward. And it was a really interesting reading experience. And I think it also, really spoke to the importance of place and land and water and, indigenous connections, to individual geographies, which I thought was really powerful. And so, just thank you for such an innovative way that you organize the anthology, which I know is always a difficult thing to do.
No, as you were saying that, I had a question. I mean, I
Mhm.
don't know that either one of us can answer it, but I was thinking about how it becomes, it's turned into almost stereotypical, you know, about natives and land and connection, but it makes sense because we're from here. There's
Mhm.
generations. We have moved up through, we know, we have, you know, we have intimate connections with the plants and the animals and the wind, the elements and the stones and the earth. And because of that close, you know, we're there, our relatives. So there, in most of in every indigenous culture I've come across here, you know, in all of my travels and readings and so on, there is that relationship that's set up so we know the land. But I think it must be the same for people, you know, of other continents or places where they're the indigenous peoples in Europe too, the indigenous peoples who have come up and know their land and how it not infiltrates, because that's not the right word. It's like the land being an outsider coming in, but how it's absolutely essential to the root structure of, say, how the English language would be structured, or other languages, or the literature produced in those places.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, what's interesting too is reading it in this way, there's kind of an undertone of sadness because, you know, we know and we're introduced to the history of displacement in all of these regions, as well as, you know, when we start to read the bios of the authors, we know that many no longer live in their traditional homelands, but they live in other parts of the US, or, you know, a larger diaspora. And so I think, you know, that sense of displacement and migration, and of course the urbanization of many Native peoples, is also comes through in this format. So I think it creates an interesting cross current, if you will.
Mhm.
Moving on, I wanted to also ask a question about aesthetics and style. I really love how inclusive you and the editors were of poems that are all kinds of different forms, different styles, different techniques. And I was wondering if you can talk about the importance of, you know, including the kind of diverse range of indigenous aesthetics.
That's always been important. It's always been important to me, and as someone who's taught off and on for 40 years, it's always been important to be inclusive in that way, because I felt that often, not at the University of when I came up as a student at the University of New Mexico, I had really fine professors there and they were very open. But what I have found often in the academic setting is that there is a way to write poetry. There's accepted aesthetic, and sometimes it's a fashionable thing that moves through, or there's and so much falls away from that. And I know I'm not saying that correctly. That's why sometimes I write when I do interviews, I'll write my answers, because so I can just think about it and say it more coherently. But I think what's important here is to realize is that we are human beings and we're individual. And we are not so much of what we deal with constantly and consistently in an academic setting and in scholarly setting and in even the popular culture, is that we're often seen as one stereotype or two. The whole culture gets diluted to a lifeless stereotype. And I think the same thing can happen to poetry or to literature, so that it gets diluted to, well, this is Native poetry, and if you don't include these elements or you do not embody this aesthetic, then we are not interested in you. The same thing happens to painters and so on. And we thought it was very important to show that the individuality, because our people really, we prize individuality. individuality, even as we move together as a people, because individuality is even diversity within a group. That's important. Just as diversity of culture and diversity of language is absolutely important for a healthy mental, spiritual field of humanity. Just as diversity is essential, absolutely essential to a biosystem. So here we are with different forms, of poems that are that point to the essentialness of diversity. And
Yeah,
that's true for Muskogee, for any of us,
mhm. I love that so much, and that really comes throughout the anthology. There's a generational diversity, a geological diversity, aesthetic diversity, and like you said, I think that really does subvert any damaging stereotypes out there about Indigenous poetry. But also I can imagine being a young Native poet reading this anthology and just having the ultimate permission to write and express themselves in every way possible.
Mm-hmm.
And along this thread, you talk a little bit about it in the introduction, and wondering if you can share for the audience what you think about the connection between our ancestral Native aesthetics and contemporary, and some of this contemporary writing, and in particular thinking about how you see the influence of oral traditions, songs, and chants on this written Native poetry.
Oh man, that would be another book. Now that's a huge question, and I would have to find a couple of poems. Well, even what even in what I had mentioned earlier with the Kumulipo, which was a chant and orality of a creation story, and then Jamaica Osorio, who I got to hear when the Hawaiian team won for that. They were part of that Brave New World series for those spoken word, the huge spoken word contests. And I got to be there. I was there. I was one of the judges along with Sonia Sanchez when they won, and I got to hear Jamaica. So the whole team was incredible. And you could hear it there. In a way, that's kind of how it came down, but there's orality. If you even look at English language or any language, it's essentially, all of our literatures are essentially texts of orality. The roots of any prose or fiction or even memoir or essay, they're texts of orality. The roots are oral, have roots of orality. And it's, the way we share that orality has changed. Sometimes it's through written, which can't always capture what you can with speaking, but it has its own, offerings to, to how stories are created and to how they're shaped and so on. And the same with poetry. Poetry especially is especially closer to orality, even if it's written, even if it's essentially intellectual, experimental stuff. The roots are still there because the words they represent sound. They represent sound, and they also represent their markers in time. So I often think of a poem as like a time machine. And one thing I love about poetry is that the poem moves you through time, moves you through, can move you through history, time, for people. But the thing I like about the written is that you can have all of this right here. And I love that about the written. And as much as I've carried on about language being a colonizing tool, it's also a trade language that allows us to speak with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I've heard it is that a few generations before me, that everybody could speak more than one native language. And they often spoke either English or Spanish or French or some other, language, depending.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Along those lines too, in terms of orality, I was also thinking about indigenous visual arts and its influence on native writing. And so I'm wondering if you see a relationship as well between visuality and textuality, if there's, a relationship between, let's say, like winter counts or earth mound designs or canoes, tattoos, other kinds of indigenous visual aesthetics on written literature.
You've just kind of answered your question. The tattoo art and others. Yeah, there's definitely. I used to tell, who is it, Jean Quick to See Smith? I used to tell her, I said, I write like a painter and you paint like a writer. Wonderful artist, Jean Quick to See Smith. And yeah, of course, I think ultimately we're dealing with certainly aesthetics and a kind of, maybe I tend to go more that way. I tend to be, everybody deals, some people are more kinetic in their expression. Other people are more sensual. There's different ways, but yes, definitely. I mean, a basket can be a text. A basket can tell you about a gathering place. It can tell you it can be a history about that gathering place, what you can find there. Medicine would be included in that. Stories of what happened to somebody over there who misbehaved. How a certain place was found and how somebody else came over to try to take over that place and how you were able to move them. And then, the shape of the basket, the designs, how they get passed on. Even, the shape the basket holds, even literally as you're weaving, the voice track, what you're saying, your thoughts, all of that, what's happening around goes into that. The trees, even the plants, the spirit of the plants that are made. It's quite an event if you think about it. I think a poem to me is like that too. A poem or a story.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And I know there are a lot of Pacific writers who also think about writing as a kind of weaving, which I think is really profound. And just for those listening, if and when you buy this anthology, there are so many amazing poems that you can feel the influence of orality that just sing right off the page. And there are many poems as well that are very visual and that, have an architecture to them, which I think is really amazing. So thank you again for including that kind of diversity. I just have two more questions before we turn to the audience question. One is about theme, which again is, across 160 poets, 400 pages. I love that there is such a diversity of theme, everything from history, culture, family, migration, food, trauma, resilience. But perhaps my favorite theme that shines through is humor and joy. Sometimes the humor is very subversive, often trickster. There are just some moments where I was cracking up out loud from some of these poems. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about Native humor in poetry. And I know, some of your work as well is, gets at that really deep sense of Native humor and joy through humor.
What poem in here? Well, one of my favorites, well, I shouldn't say, I love all of them, is that, and it gets at a humor and you think, okay, a lot of people have these, Indian school. And Indian schools can be pretty intense, especially early on when students, well, I would say early on when students were dragged away from their families and their homes with no, into a whole different culture and language, and the parents crying after, it was very traumatic. But which can even happen these days, and that's another story. It does happen. And one of the early poems in the collection is called My Industrial Work, written by an anonymous, a student. And I could just hear some of this. I taught the last high school class at IA, and I could hear some of the students, like, they don't want anybody to know they wrote the poem, or anonymous. And so the Carlisle Indian School was a military style school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, founded by Colonel Richard Henry Pratt in 1879 for assimilation. And his infamous motto was "Kill the Indian and save the man." So they recruited a lot of children, including some of my ancestors, to go to that school. And there's a huge gravesite over there too, because many of them didn't make it. But they had a school, they still have in their archives, I guess. There's a story by an aunt of mine about a bear, a little story written by the kids. So someone there was publishing their poems. And this poem was in one of those publications. And I love the humor in here. Here's a kid, and we don't know what tribe he is. We don't know, but, high school kid or junior high, middle school. And you can hear a middle school kid from any age, from any age, even from now. But the military system was in place, just like it was for my Indian school in the late 60s, even though we had arts, was all of the military terminology. We didn't have to go march outside early in the morning, but we had to go to our details and either clean or cook. And but I want to read this poem, My Industrial Work, for the humor in it. This was written in the 1800s, this was written in 1913. My Industrial Work. At 2:30 in the afternoon, you can find me in the 28 room. About 3 or 4 covers deep, you turn them back and you'll find me asleep. And there I lie and patiently wait for the final exams we have in room 8. When the whistle blows at 5:30, once more I am up and still alive. Then I run down and wash my face and comb my hair, and I'm ready for grace. In 15 minutes, there's a bugle call. The troops fall in and the roll is called. Then out in front, the troops all stand, saluting the flag with our hats in our hands. While standing in the wind, our hair gets wavy, but just the same, we right face and march to gravy. Now this may sound like going a-fishing, but this is my only industrial position.
Thank you for sharing that. So my last question for you actually is kind of connected to where I am out here in the Pacific. Many anthologies of Native literature have appeared over the past 50 years, as you document in the introduction. And when I first started studying Native American literary anthologies, I noticed a Pacific writer would appear here and there, especially in the 90s. Haunani K. Trask, Dana Naone Hall, for example. This anthology, though, has around 16 Pacific Islander poets. There's a whole section dedicated to the Pacific, edited by Hawaiian poet Brandy Nalani McDougall. And so I wanted to ask, why was it important for you to include Pacific Islander poetry within this anthology? And I know you have deeper connections to the Pacific, so if you wanted to share those as well, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I was thinking when I started writing poetry, the first Native poetry anthology had no women in it at all. That was the first one that I read. There were no women. And so, why include it? Well, they're part of, this is a North American, not just North American, but of what's now called America, and the islands are part of that. I would say that a failing here is that we probably should have included some Taino poets. I thought about that in the middle of the night at moments, you know, and I think about what I could have, what we should have added, but I still get haunted by thinking, well, this should be all of North America. But I think that, yes, I have deeper ties. In fact, it goes back to old stories that I've been told that that one of the stories goes that 7 Polynesian canoes came ashore. And you think, well, where was the Creek Nation then? But if you look at a map with the Pacific at the center, you can see what happened. You can see how it moved with the water. All you do is follow the water lines, follow the water roads which lead up into mountain roads, and the roots of some of our Muskogee Creek people are along those routes. But there is a story. There is a story like that. But it's always been, I don't know, it's always been important to, and I don't think I'm the only one, but to include the Pacific, to include the Pacific Island people. I'm familiar somewhat with California Native people and their music a little bit and their culture, and going up into Alaska. And you know that at some point it was all together. There's a connection. So
it's beautiful to think about how the water connects us. And I definitely, as a Pacific writer myself, I appreciate the kind of trans-indigenous connections and solidarity that this anthology embodies. And definitely, as you say, there's so much amazing Native poetry across the Americas, the Pacific, the Caribbean, and of course globally. And I think this anthology is a beautiful window into those spaces. So thank you for including our work, and we can't wait to welcome you back here in Hawaii soon. So I now want to turn to questions from the audience. We have 2 so far, and the first has to do with the idea of generations. This person writes, in Native writing, the generation seems to have a special status. Can you talk more about that, how it works, both in terms of memory and in terms of writing?
I grew up in a time, I guess that term, I don't know how long that term had been coined, the 7 generations, and to think forward to 7 generations, not just about, your own generation or not. It's to not be so short-sighted, but to remember there are those who are going to follow, and then there are those who have come before, and you're only part of a much larger context. And to keep in mind that much larger context. Because I was a very young mother, I was a teenage mother, and my daughter was a teenage mother. And I guess her daughter was also a teenage mother. She was 20 yet. I'm a very young great-grandmother. So I have gotten to experience generations in a way, in a manner in which I've come to understand more too of what they were speaking of, and to realize that each generation is like an entity or a person. We come in certainly within our ancestral lineal genealogy, and that's one kind of river, movement. But we also come, which is probably more vertical, but then we also come in a more horizontal movement as part of a generational structure that connects everyone. And those generations have definite personality traits. They do. They definitely personality traits, and they also move through history and deal with moments of history because of their placement where they are, just as in a family, whether you're, in relationship to the generation directly before you, the one that skips, and then those that are coming in. And so there is that connection, and I can see that in this anthology. how each generation, I'm familiar with my own generation coming up, as literary artists in America, and how we found ourselves together and sometimes at odds with each other. We're human beings. But how we found ourselves and made a literature that connected us, and yet was, as you were pointing out, Craig, is that there's differences. And then I've watched how, because a generation comes up, was my generation, we didn't have internet. We had just gotten television, black and white television. We didn't have cell phone. It does make a difference in the production of literature and the perception, how you tell your stories. So it's interesting to watch that generationally, and also to think about the generation just before mine. And I get included with Simon Ortiz and Jim Welch and all of those guys, but I think of them, or like Mama Day, who just won the Frost Medal, which is cool, is being Mama Day definitely. And then Simon Ortiz is pretty much part of that, as a generation before. And then the generation before them. So I've had a sense of all of those. And so the more context you can get, the more you come to understand that a family is one person, almost, with all of these elements. You come to understand that this generational thing binds us transnationally across the earth. And now
Yes,
I've started, I'll be 70 this year. And I've come to see how, okay, I think I'm starting to get what they mean by this, seventh generation. I mean, we all say it, talk about it, but you start to kind of grasp it in a way that's not always quite so possible, because when you're younger.
That's beautiful. Thank you. The next question actually is related. It says, you seem to have come of age at a moment of great explosion in Native American writing. Can you talk about that moment, about your influences, what was in the air when you started writing?
Yes, I was a student. When I started writing, I went to IAI, and there was Native poetry going on. Might have to stand up in a minute. There's Native poetry going, there's student poetry going on. Vincent Price used to finance an anthology, but I never wrote poetry. I was an artist. I love poetry and I love music and that kind of thing. But it wasn't until I was at the University of New Mexico. I was my first semester, I was a pre-med major with a minor in dance, and then I went back into the art studios, and I heard Simon Ortiz, the Yakima poet, and started going to poetry readings at the university, hearing all kinds of poets like Anne Waldman, and became I met Leslie Silko, came and later taught, the Laguna Pueblo writer, poet, novelist. And at that time in New Mexico, there were all kinds of poets. People like to come to New Mexico. And so there was sort of like a lot of artists. I took a lot of photography classes and so on. And Laura Tohi and I were both, the Navajo poet and I were both art major students at the University of New Mexico at the same time. I remember hanging out with her. And, but there were also these National Flori Canto gatherings going on, which were these really cool readings and gatherings of like everybody in the neighborhood, of all indigeneities and all kinds of cultural backgrounds, people, Irish American, Asian American, African American, everybody coming together and saying, this is American literature, Chicano literature, Ricardo Sanchez, Alarista. And I knew about James Welch, but he lived up in the other part of the country, and I eventually got to meet him. We all knew about Scott Momaday, But yes, I started writing, and then I writing it as an art major. And then I took an extra year because I changed my major. I was in the first UNM class with a BA in creative writing major. I was the first graduating class with that. So it took over. But I did come up within in a very exciting time. And Ishmael Reed came to the school too around that time. And he was kind of at the forefront of this multicultural movement. Because up to that time in our classrooms, we didn't read Native writers. We didn't know there were Native poets or anyone else. It was all very Euro-American literature that we were reading and studying. So I came up during that moment of shift, feminist writing, women writing, and it was quite a shift. It did not happen easily, and it's still not happening easily, but it's much farther along than when I was coming up as a young poet. But I feel like I was pretty lucky coming up with all of those, with everyone. Sandra Cisneros and I were in graduate school together, and we've been friends. We consider each other sisters. We've been friends all this time. So it's been something I suppose I should write about at some point.
The next memoir.
Yeah, no. I tell my husband that the next memoir is going to be about him. I use it as I'm going to do a trilogy, and the next one, just teasing.
That's funny. Well, thank you for reminiscing about those times. I could listen to you talk story about those early days of the so-called Renaissance, all these amazing poets that, I studied being from Cal in the comparative ethnic studies doctoral program, reading across ethnicity and poets from different cultural backgrounds. And you lived through that era, and you continue to do that good work today and inspire the next generations. So thank you for that. Since we're almost out of time, we did have one last request, but I was going to say, if you wanted to stand up and stretch, the request is if you could read one of your poems from the anthology. But if you wanted to stand up first, Joy, and stretch a little before
I think I can
close us out.
Yeah.
All right. So this is it, folks. We're so thankful again for everyone for attending and for Joy's time.
I can read a poem if you want. If you want me to read a poem, I can do that.
Yes, please. If you can close us out with one of your poems, that would be amazing.
Oh man, I have 3 in here.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do Running. It's kind of intense, but I don't think the outcome is intense. I mean, what we use, the materials for poetry are, those, as Audre Lorde is known for saying, it's the tools for poetry are often those things that could destroy us, but we turn them into something else. And this is called Running. It's closing time. Violence is my boyfriend with a cross to bear. Hoisted on by the church, he wears it everywhere. There are no female deities in the Trinity. I don't know how I'm going to get out of here, said the flying fish to the tree. Last call, we've had it with history. We who look for vision here in the Indian and Poetry Bar, somewhere to the left of hell. Now I had to find my way when there's a river to cross and no boat to get me there, when there appears to be no home at all. My father gone, chased by the stepfather's gun. Get out of here. I found my father at the bar, his ghost at least. Some piece of him in this sorry place. The boyfriend's convincing to a crowd. Right now, he's the spell of attraction. What tales he tells in the fog of thin hope. I wander this sad world we've made of the enemy's words. The lights quiver like they do when the power's dwindling to a dangling stream. It's time to go home. We are herded like stone cattle, like children for the bombing drill. Out the door into the dark street of this old Indian town where there are no Indians anymore. I was afraid of the dark because then I could see everything. The truth with its eyes staring back at me. The mouth of the dark with its shiny moon teeth. No words, just a hiss and a snap. I could hear my heart hurting with my in the dark ears. I thought I could take it. Where is the party? It's been a century since we left home with the American soldiers at our backs. The party had long started up in the parking lot. He flew through the dark, broke my stride with a punch. I went down, then came up. I thought I could take being a girl with her heart in her arms. I carried it for justice, for the rights of all Indians. We all had that cross to bear. Those old ones followed me, the quiet girl with the long dark hair, the daughter of a warrior who wouldn't give up. I wasn't ready yet to fling free the cross. I ran and I ran to the 2 a.m. streets. It was my way of breaking free. I was anything but history. I was the wind.
That was
That's a tough one to
breathtaking.
end on.
No, that was perfect. Thank you, Joy Harjo, for the honor of this conversation today. Thank you for your years of work editing this important anthology. Thank you for serving as the US Poet Laureate and for doing such amazing work in that capacity. I'm looking forward to your conversation tomorrow with the Townsend Center and Dr. Beth Piatot. Please take good care of yourself. Thank you, everybody, for listening as well to our live stream. You take good care and will join us for tomorrow's event.
Okay.
Sidus Maasi. Thank you. Aloha.
Mado, mahalo nui loa. Thank you.